The discussion will be moderated by one of the faculty members throughout the event, and if you are designated to speak, you will be invited to do so. Otherwise, we kindly ask you to mute your mics to reduce unnecessary noises. With that, we also want to welcome you to utilize the chat window for comments, questions, and reactions, and we'll try to address them if we can during the roundtable or afterwards. And I think we are ready to begin and bring this. If you'd like to start recording, hope it's okay with everybody. I would like to open up by inviting us to take a moment and to acknowledge the land that each of us is calling from. I must admit that it is really hard to do a good land acknowledgement, given the centuries of colonization, displacement, and unmeasurable violence that and disrespect that has been inflicted upon and continues to be inflicted upon the peoples of this land, who have been living, raising families and nurturing this land from times immemorial, the land on which we live and prosper today. At California College of the Arts, we acknowledge the names of and legacies of Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, and the names of Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, whose territories we occupy. Let's pause a moment and think of these questions by Sogoroete Land Trust, urban indigenous women-led organization facilitating return of indigenous land to indigenous people. Each of us can take collective responsibility to move from a statement to action, which includes supporting Black and indigenous-led organizations that are committed to tending and repatriating the land. In this event, we are hoping to address the issues of cultural preservation and representation of the historically marginalized communities of color, in particular, the Hoover-Foster neighborhood in West Oakland. This semester, hi Walter, this semester 4 courses from 3 different design schools came together to partner with WOCAN, West Oakland Cultural Action Network, and Black Liberation Walking Tour, whose mural you see on the slide, in introducing the aspects of community activism and social infrastructure as foundational components in architecture and urban design. We have invited representatives of professional practice, grassroots organization, and civic leadership to share their experience in developing reciprocal relationships between the industry, the city, and the people to achieve common goals. To briefly introduce the courses participating in this partnership, the 2 studios that are joining us from the East Coast are called Aging Against the Machine. Karen Kubey's studio, and Karen can do wave, at Pratt Institute of Interior Design envisions new models of care that promote social cohesion through interior design, challenging isolation and industrialized modes of healthcare for the elderly. Ignacio Galán, if you can wave, studio at Barnard and Columbia Colleges explores multi-scalar infrastructures that support the life of aging individuals and incorporate their experiences and sensibilities. Karen and Ignacio are collaborating with Neeraj Bhatia from CCA on a research project for the elderly population in West Oakland and a corresponding exhibition at the Center for Architecture in New York. Neeraj Bhatia and Nataly Gattegno studio that you see in that window in California College of the Arts called Common Space, Reframing the Public Library, looks at the expanded notion of sharing to form an urban commons that centers on and reframes the role of public library. And finally, Janette Kim and I, Julia Grinkrug, are teaching architectural analysis seminar for the same cohort of students at CCA, exploring speculative techniques of spatial analysis that study the relationship between cities, buildings, and people, and lay the groundwork for an architectural practice that is both contextual and inventive. Our agenda for today is to have a round of introductions and then 3 rounds of questions from the students that we frame along 3 thematic topics of knowledge, sharing, and care. And with that, I'll unshare screen. Yeah, sorry. And before I move on to introduce our guests, I would like to thank Jamie Austin and Brandy's Harso daughter, if you can wave at us, from CCA Exhibitions and Public Programs for helping us organizing this event. And this event is jointly funded by an endowment gift to support the Deborah and Kenneth Novack Creative Citizen Series at CCA, an annual series of public programs focused on creative activism, and also it's funded by jointly by Barnard College and Columbia University. I would also like to thank our incredible partner, David Peters, the man behind the Black Liberation Walking Tour, for his tireless and passionate support for our educational endeavors, providing invaluable community-rooted knowledge. And I thought that David will join us, but I don't think I see him. Oh, David, hello. So I wanted to invite David maybe to say a few words about Black Liberation Walking Tour and your interest in this work.
Thanks, Julia. I appreciate both the kind introduction to this group, as well as your relentless volunteerism and constant connecting of me and our groups to resources, which are invaluable to being able to access, tools, resources, social capital, financial resources, technical resources that have allowed both the Black Liberation Walking Tour to happen, as well as its growth into the West Oakland Cultural Action Network. I, as you know, and so for the rest of the folks, I'm a 3rd generation West Oakland resident. I've been 4 years ago, moved next door to the house that I was born in. And so my family's been rooted here on this block since 1950, and not for the US and for Oakland, and not inconsiderable amount of time. And so that has, between, being here and family being here and others, has provided just a certain amount of cultural knowledge of the neighborhood, cultural knowledge, historical knowledge of this neighborhood. And it was in kind of just walking around the neighborhood and kind of questioning from my own self, why am I so passionate about a place where illegal dumping is tolerated, where we experience unequitable and inordinate amounts of homelessness, where there are issues of public safety and inequality, where we see great and increasing levels of gentrification and displacement. And I was like, this, from someone who's not from here, this is an ostensibly ugly looking place, physical environment from the outside. And so I questioned, like, why did I love it so much? And I loved it so much because something had happened here. And I was inspired by a quote that Mr. Hood wrote that said something along this lines, and I'll paraphrase, that placemaking is colonizing. If you look, something has happened everywhere. And I realized as I walked around, lots of things had happened in this neighborhood. And as I would engage with my neighbors, newer and older, there was a great hunger to understand, what had happened in these blocks. And so I set about wanting to tell that story, because I think not only is it a tale that stands on its own of the historic, cultural, and artistic sites in the neighborhood, but there's also a narrative that exists there. And so for me, this Black liberation walking tour, I want to tell Black liberative narrative that sort of starts in the 19 teens with Delilah Beasley, and certainly there were, Black folks here before that, but for my purposes, for the work we've done now, we're starting there and then bringing it all the way up through the present day. And so one of the other things I thought about is lots of people are attracted to Oakland by the Panthers and the Panther legacy. But the Panthers didn't spring unbidden from Huey and Bobby's heads. They rested on folks that came before them. And so I think there's a narrative to tell, and the density of cultural sites, these tour stops in this neighborhood, is rather remarkable. And so we set about to create a digital self-guided audio walking tour, relying on some folks that are really good at telling stories. Liam O'Donoghue from East Bay Yesterday, Gene Anderson from the Oakland Wiki, he's done a lot of walking tours. Really, this idea, as I began to talk about it, and pretty passionate about it, really took root. And a lot of people saw the vision and jumped on board, including yourself, who worked and volunteered on this committee, who contributed very meaningfully to what we're trying to do, both with the tour itself and with our presentations of that. And so now the tour is, out in the world as, this thing, but it's so much deeper than that. Really, this tour is about this idea of a cultural shield in the neighborhood. And so it's really a tool to be able to identify people who, like me, are multi-generation Black property holders who have a stake in this neighborhood from when we were redlined and who are now trying to hold place here. And so I believe that by connecting with these folks, we are stronger together, and that we can stand with each other and for each other in trying to guide development along this corridor. And so that is really what the outcome, the plan and intended outcome of this was acquire commercial property around the corridor, community controlled for community designated and defined purposes. And so I think that dovetails very nicely with the work that you're doing here. And it is essential, I believe, that we build these bonds between academia, between other folks who are in the neighborhood, business owners, that we encourage them to actually interact with everyday residents and not only with museums and with ivory tower folks, so that there is value in regular people like me and my neighbors who may not be trained in these arts or have fancy degrees. Our lived experience is invaluable. And so we seek to make those bridges, not only with those types of resources, but as we had some volunteers in here yesterday who are also supporting them, the phrase I've been using is labor is love. And so it's not only the financial resources, not only the technical resources, but to really gain trust in communities, you got to show up. You got to show up, you got to be willing to do the grunt work. And then we begin to build some measure of trust. But there are many ways in which myself and many others have felt exploited by these sorts of collaborations. So I will always encourage to do it with love, do it with care. There's some protocols around this that I didn't know about, which I'm sure will come up. And I just want to thank you again for having me here and for the past, the current, and the future of the work that we're doing together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's awesome. Right. So with that, thank you, David. I want to turn our attention to our panelists, and I want to thank each and every one of you for joining this roundtable and carving the time out of your busy schedules. So thanks a lot. I'll give very brief introduction and we'll invite you to expand on it. So Dorothy Lazard is, if you can wave at us, the legendary head librarian in the Oakland Public Library, who, quoting a KQED article, holds the key to Oakland's history. She is managing the History Center at the library and is a gatekeeper to a long list of books, periodicals, photos, and other documents that tell the story of the city. Many of these items would be difficult to find anywhere else, such as Blacks in Oakland from 1852 to 1987 by Donald Hausler, or a biography of Delilah Beasley, who David mentioned, Oakland's crusading journalist who lived in Hoover-Foster neighborhood. Growing up in Oakland, Dorothy Lazard can speak about Oakland history from personal experience. Leslie Bowling-Dyer, you can wave at us, describes herself on Twitter as a thinker, neighbor, mom, partner, daughter, niece, clergy, PhD student. Heir to beautiful, soulful Black struggle, recipient of grace, lover of justice. Reverend Bowling-Dyer is PhD student at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, a doctoral fellow at the Forum of Technological Exploration, and ordained minister at Ellen Temple Baptist Church. As a resident of Hoover-Foster, Reverend Leslie is an active member of RAC, Hoover-Foster Resident Action Council, and together with her husband, Philip Bowling-Dyer, who serves as a treasurer for the organization. And last but not the least, Walter Hood is a celebratory landscape architect in West Oakland. He is the creative director and founder of Hood Design Studio and a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Walter Hood lectures on professional and theoretical projects nationally and internationally, and is a recipient of numerous professional awards, too many to list them all. But just to name a few, these are Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award, Knight Public Spaces Fellowship, MacArthur Fellowship, Dorothy and Lillian Gish Prize, and most recently, the Architectural League's President's Medal Award. Walter Hood is a renowned public speaker and an author of several iconic books that center Black leadership in architecture and design, such as Black Landscapes Matter and Urban Diaries that explores scenes of life in the community of West Oakland, California. And with that, I will invite each one of you to expand on those short introductions. And I know Dorothy is attending the front desk.
Sorry about that.
Would you mind to start us off, Dorothy?
Oh, certainly. Do you want me to fill in about my role here?
Yes,
well, as Julia said, I'm the head librarian here at the Oakland History Center, which is a research division of the Oakland Public Library. We work with all kinds of people in the city, new residents, old residents, students, architects, real estate developers, real estate agents, government workers, municipal workers, certainly people from City Hall, the planning department especially, and also lots and lots of creatives, filmmakers, architects, poets, novelists. So the work is, the collection is very extensive. It has a variety of formats, and I feel like it certainly tethers me to the city in a way that traditional librarianship had not. I grew up here in Oakland, came to Oakland when I was about 11. My family moved to Oakland from San Francisco when it was being gentrified in the late 60s, early 70s. And it became too expensive to live there. So we moved over here for a variety of reasons. And so this work has really made me, I always say, a better citizen, in that I am learning about, not only learning about the city, but engaging in the city in a much deeper way, working with all those people I named on a much deeper level than I would have done if I were working at a traditional reference desk where you're just handing someone a book or, you know, a DVD or something like that. I'm very much engaged in their projects, in their process, in their thesis and dissertations and so forth, and asking them questions as they ask me questions. That certainly helps build our collection here. And it also helps them by us sharing the resources that we have here. So it's a very mutual, symbiotic kind of relationship that I have with a lot of different segments of the Oakland and East Bay, and actually international population. We have lots and lots of international scholars coming in to learn more about the city, people from all over the country, to learn more about the city and how it's run, how it was physically built, but also how it has been culturally and politically built. So that's a really interesting part of my work. And it's, as I've always said, it's the best job I've ever had. And I do it for free, but not really. So I also feel like I am obligated today to say that I am retiring in December. So it'll be kind of an end of an era for me, but I've been a librarian for like 38 years, and I kind of want to know what my garden looks like in the middle of the day. So it's been quite a lot of fun. It's been very instructive to do this work and to be responsible for a community resource like the Oakland History Center. It has a long, long history in Oakland. It is, we've had at Oakland Public Library a history collection of some sort since the 1920s. We've been here in this building since 1951. So there's always been this need and will of Oaklanders to have some institutional collection that reflects its city. I see my job as, and all of the jobs I've ever held as a librarian, as one, the responsibility chiefly being one that represents the Oakland that I know and am a part of. And so I always work toward diversity. I always work toward gathering stories from people who may not be from the academy. And I feel like that's where many of our stories lie that we don't know. And as I've said before in interviews, what's the story behind the story? You know, I was invited by the Oakland Heritage Alliance a couple of years ago to write about across the country, they were observing the sesquicentennial of the Transcontinental Railroad. And, you know, most people feel like they know that story. It's there was a railroad in the east and a railroad in the west, and they met in Promontory Point, Utah, and there were some Black Pullman porters. But what's the story behind that story? How did Black people become involved? I wanted to know, in the railroads. And they had been involved in the railroads, in the building of the railroads, not just providing service on the railroads. Since the very beginning, they were building railroads as enslaved people and reconstructing railroads during the Civil War. So I wanted to get beyond that service with a smile paradigm that we think we know about Pullman porters, which is such an essential Oakland story. And so that has been my self-appointed mission here, is to find stories behind the story. How are people welcomed into places? How do people share space? That's all I'll say for now.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, and thank you for joining.
And excuse me, but there are like 4 people at the reference desk, so if I jump in and out, please forgive me.
Multitasking. And Leslie.
Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Leslie Bowling-Dyer. I originally from San Jose, East Side, San Jose, California, and have been in Oakland since I was about 18 when I moved in with an uncle in East Oakland to attend UC Berkeley, and with a couple of short, brief times out, have pretty much been in the city since then. I moved into West Oakland with my husband when we wanted to move near and raise our kids near our in-laws, near his parents. And so we bought a house that is 5 blocks away from the home in West Oakland on 27th and West, where he grew up, born and raised. And so he, like myself, you know, he left the neighborhood for a while to pursue education and other career, but this is where we came back to. So we've been here for about, 16 years now, raised 2 kids here in the neighborhood and have seen significant change in that time, have had opportunities to really become, to try to help mobilize neighbors at various levels to various degrees to accomplish various things as we felt the needs arise, and have seen sort of some of those efforts, you know, both ebb and flow and crest and descend. But right now we are both involved with the Hoover-Foster Resident Action Council. Myself, I am a member of the organization and community organization, and volunteer, put most of my volunteer hours there. And then my husband is the treasurer. So I get a fly on the wall view of the leadership team, but am really here because they have been so generous in allowing me to come and represent what I understand or how I experience the Hoover-Foster Resident Action Council, and am really grateful for that. So that is me.
Thank you, Leslie. And maybe let's give the mic to Walter to fill in.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to meet everyone, Dorothy and Leslie. I think, Dorothy, I probably met you years ago when I first moved to Oakland. And I think I came to the library because I wanted to know more about Oakland. That's when libraries were the go-to versus Google. But I've been in West Oakland now. This is my 30th year, just thinking, and I guess I would owe my entire professional life and academic career to West Oakland. I was living in Berkeley, and one day I just got tired of living in Berkeley. And I wanted to be in a place where people look like me. And I remember getting a studio at 29th and I want to say Telegraph. This is like early 90s. And so it was like very different. And I remember the first few years, I had a couple of parties and all my friends from Berkeley would come and their cars would get broken into. And slowly, over 30 years, none of my Berkeley friends visit me in West Oakland, which is a sign, right? I mean, it says a lot about these two landscapes that I navigate. I find it, for me being here in Berkeley, navigating these two landscapes keep me honest. It gives me a kind of a critical eye on the world, because on one, I go to this privileged place that's highly invested in, and then I go home in the afternoon to a place that's not invested in. And I keep asking myself over 30 years, it's like, why am I still there? Why am I still here? And slowly, the reason why is because I love the people who in my neighborhood. I like seeing them every day. And it's a reassuring sort of act for me that they're still there. You know, people talk about the gentrification of West Oakland. On my street, you know, the houses have turned around, but same people are still there. You know, and unfortunately for some, they don't live in the best, healthiest place, but they're still there. And I know as long as I'm still there, I'm contributing to them being there. When I first bought a place on Filbert, 30th and Filbert, it's a live work studio that we were all artists. I would say today, 80% lifestyle. I would say the value of those lifestyle units have probably tripled. The lifestyle is really about only the building, not the neighborhood. And I think that's the bigger issue, that people who are moving in, they're not interested in living in the neighborhood, they're interested in the lifestyle that the buildings afford them. And so for my practice, we're constantly trying to call attention, right, to these places and the devaluation of place. And currently I have this running argument with my faith-based nonprofits in my neighborhood. who have these great goals, but I've watched them over the 30 years not improve the neighborhood. And I got into a conversation with one faith-based investor who's now building housing in the area. And I just said, why can't we have pedestrian lights and street trees? And they immediately said, oh, because it'll gentrify the area. And that to me is kind of that conundrum, right? Where people who don't live in our landscape want to paternalistically define it, that they know what's best for us, and they go home in the afternoon, they don't stay there in the evenings. And I would welcome any of them to stay there, that they would actually see something quite different. And now in our 30th year, to put our money where our mouth is, we're actually purchasing a building on San Pablo. And hopefully it will become our new studio space, but hopefully we can begin to demonstrate to the nonprofits along the street that you can give value to a place, that you can create a different kind of aesthetic, and that you can talk about our neighborhood in a completely different way without being afraid of change, because change is actually happening. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Walter. This is an amazing honor to have all three of you here. And I think without further ado, I will pass the mic to our first question session moderator, Karen Kubey, to start us off with questions from Pratt, and we'll continue this conversation going. So Karen, mic to you.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be a part of this. I'm a Californian and Berkeley grad calling in from Brooklyn, and the professor for one of the studios that Julia was talking about. So my role is to introduce the first topic that we'll hear questions from students on, which is knowledge. So we'll be looking at knowledge as power, as access to education as information, and information through civic institutions such as libraries, and thinking about promoting a sense of self-worth and community heritage. And Professor Hood, what we just heard from you about thinking about what gentrification really means and doesn't mean really ties directly into our first question. So we have a question from Marlo at Pratt, and Tiffany will be asking it. Turning it over to you, Tiffany.
Hi. Our first question is, how do we ensure that our projects aren't contributing further to the problem of gentrification through creating new developments? And what design strategies can we use to integrate the surrounding community into our new designs?
Tiffany, do you want to direct it to somebody particular to start us off? Now, when you heard the introductions.
I guess, Walter, since you just were speaking about gentrification, maybe you could sort of continue along the lines of what was said or mentioned.
Yeah, first I'm going to respond to David. I'm just going through escrow, David, so I'm trying to figure out a way to kind of talk about this new building in light of some other development that's happening. I don't know, I guess I come at, the question of gentrification, always comes up as, there's going to be change in a place, right? And a lot of people, particularly architects and planners, think that anything they do is going to displace. And I just left my class, I'm teaching a class on landscape and memory, and I asked my students this morning, I was like, would you not want someone to come into your neighborhood? Let's say you have a very, benign landscape. Let's say there's no investment. And that if you live in a place, you would tell people not to come in and create a more safe and a more inviting landscape. And I mean, just with the basic metrics that you might see in other places. A landscape strips and street trees, low-level lighting, even street closure if you wanted, but all of those kinds of things that we know make good neighborhoods. And in a lot of places, people are afraid to actually even propose those things because immediately they think that that's going to have an impact, is pushing people out. And I ask the question of just, doesn't everyone deserve a healthy landscape to live in? And those base things we know, I don't need to map certain places to know what the issues are, right? And why can't we just do the basic baseline things? And to me, those are the things that we don't even do the basic baseline things. And so I would say, take care of those baseline things first. And once you do those baseline things, maybe then you can begin to have discussions about other kinds of improvements. And I'll give you an example. On San Pablo right now, I noticed between where Flint's Barbecue is and 30th Street, the city has been putting in new infrastructure for San Pablo. It has nothing to do with people, it has everything to do with cars. How can you look at a landscape where people are waiting on food every day under a freeway, where there's garbage everywhere, and your number one thing right now, our investment is giant street infrastructure that says crossing, that says freeway. And the last thing, I think we just got new curb ramps for ADA crossing, right? And so these are things that from someone who lives in a neighborhood and I see that kind of investment, I know then that no one's actually looking at us, right? They're thinking of other things. They're not thinking about the people who live there.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
Just to build on what you're saying, Walter, I think people's resistance to gentrification is not rooted in so much the physical improvements that come with what we call gentrification. I think the anxiety about it comes from the process before we get to those infrastructures, of the lack of engagement of the community. So much of Oakland's history has been rooted in, aggressive kinds of engagements like eminent domain. I'm just going to come and take, it's kind of like this kind of colonizer approach. I'm going to take this land because I can make better use of this land. I'm not going to give you any or much opportunity to defend your space here. And I think that's where the anxiety comes in. And that's where, so by the time, Joe Tech moves into, Peralta Street, the community is feeling, some kind of way. They're feeling bitter about where were we in this process? When do we get a voice in what happens to our environment? And also, it makes very clear that until the right kind of people show up, there won't be street lights, there won't be crosswalks, there won't be community gardens. But, gentrification is this cyclical thing. Cities we always think of cities as, oh, that's where I was born and that's where my grandparents were born. And, this is where I went to high school. And we get, we're looking at it through, and as we should, a very social, cultural kind of way. But cities really, in a really unromantic way, are about making money. And the people who don't have any money tend to be the least empowered people in a city. And, it goes in cycles. There's like divestment, displacement, and then reinvestment, to draw more capital into the metropolis. And so we are reminded, and when we look at gentrification, we're reminded of, well, why couldn't we get any street lights before Joe Tech and Molly Coffee Shop showed up?
Right. Right.
So that's what I wanted to add.
And if I may, I appreciate that perspective, because I think that a large challenge to this is the ways in which we have structured land use as a matter of private property for a community that does not have generational wealth. When property becomes, and we use markets to distribute private property, then what you're beginning to do is to actually invest power in some interests, some desires, certain aesthetics more than others. And you don't have to listen to communities of color if they do not have the economic ability to challenge land use in particular ways. So when land use is seen as a zero-sum game and it's a competitive market upon which land use is derived, and when land, I think when we talk about being from a place, we're also talking about the ways in which people construct their identities. And so it does become very threatening that identity, the networks out of which people's identities are formed, is both a matter of the places they have been and the memories that they possess, and the proximities of the people that allow them to practice those identities and re-practice them over and over again. And what you begin to do is those are very the fact that identities are more practiced than just exist, and that we need to constantly practice them, actually makes them very vulnerable. And so the minute you split up people, that is a damage to identity. I can no longer practice who I am because now one member lives in Vallejo, another member lives in Seaside, another member's in Stockton. So we can no longer practice our communally held values. And we have begun to become frayed and thin. And so now our capacity to even speak with a unified voice has become challenged. So I do think that I think like you do, Walter, like, okay, I'm very visually oriented and love the aesthetic of, but I think even aesthetics are culturally informed understandings, and culturally, they're social constructions in and of themselves. And I think they are constructed differently across different groups for different reasons. And so I think it is a very complex issue, though I would say that people, I would like to see I think there should be some basic human rights around cleanliness and quality of life that we continually don't meet in communities of color. And I think the questions that is being raised here is an important one, but I think it's also fraught with a lot of historical baggage, as well as it's also intertwined with some of the broader systems, economic and political systems that we have as well. And that just makes it that much more complicated.
Mm-hmm. And I think, just to add to what Leslie's saying, there are a lot of different levels of displacement. There's displacement before you actually start packing bags to move. What was going on in the Western Addition when I was a kid was I lived with my grandmother and mother when I was a kid. And it wasn't so much that we were forced out right away or forced out. Well, yeah, I mean, there were a lot of stories here, but the things that my grandmother relied upon that made the community, her space, the cleaners, the grocer, the shoe shop, whatever she engaged in was also leaving. So before we started packing, there was already some kind of displacement. Well, I don't want to go to that grocery store. I don't know those people. Or this store is too expensive. And so you start losing things even before you engage a landlord, or before you can't pay a mortgage, or before the new neighbor says, you're playing your music too loud, I just wanted to add that equation to the mix too, is displacement is a lot of different things.
Right, thank you. I want to invite, we have a great question from Nataly at Barnard that relates to what we're talking about. Nataly.
Hi guys, I just want to thank everyone for coming and for the organizers. This is great. My question is, how do you understand the idea of intergenerational knowledge in the communities surrounding San Pablo Avenue? Are there particular sites or customs like public space, murals, that are activation points for the passing down of knowledge, businesses, spaces, roles, etc.? And this is directed towards anyone who is willing to answer it. Thank you.
I will take a shot here. First by saying thank you for the question. And I love the idea that our activation points for the passing down of knowledge. I love the, you will probably hear a repetitive sense of which I think we are always actively constructing history and knowledge. So I think knowledge is always partial. And I think it's easy to have a sort of conquest posture towards knowledge. Okay, I think even like Dorothy was saying, you know, it's like, oh, I know that story. I've been there, done that. But that stories are always open to interpretation in new contexts, in new times. There's new aspects of history to reflect on and new narratives or new themes that we might hear that we kind of go in our own time like, oh, wow, actually that speaks back to. So I think there's, you know, it should be an invitation to always be absorbing new perspectives and new knowledge. So I think that, and new lessons and the shaping of and the learning of how a tradition may actually begin to take shape and form in a different way in a new context. So I think intergenerational knowledge in communities, I don't feel like I can speak for everybody in West Oakland. I can speak for my neighborhood and how in my little, you know, 13, 15 houses, it happens. And, you know, and it's both, I think in, you know, experientially, it is, I'm cleaning on a sidewalk and I'm cleaning a street, and then Miss, who's a neighbor who's got this empty lot there, and we get to talking and something gets passed down. So sometimes it happens in the informal spaces. Sometimes it happens in more formal spaces, you know, like the rack, and you're able to ask questions and we inform one another. And then, you know, then there's always those more concretized things of the murals and those kinds of things. So I think it happens kind of in micro spaces and in micro interactions, and which also speaks to the partiality of the knowledge, is that, you know, if you didn't talk to so-and-so, you would miss that aspect of something about the community or its history. But then there always are those folks who have that sort of institutional knowledge that, you know, spans multiple years, and they are the holders of particular stories, and those become a touch point as well. So that's one version of, I think, for me, how I experience intergenerational knowledge being passed down, and it's, and always, you know, anything that is concretized, anything that's in concrete, that's in metal, that's in, has a little bit more staying power than the fact that human interactions can be somewhat precarious. So I think, you know, that's why they begin to take on such importance, is because they do feel like they are have a little bit more staying power and a little more assured. But it's, I don't think we want to confuse that with their overall substance or importance, but just recognize that they are something that they are highly contested and fought over, and they're always interpreted, right? Even themselves. So even, you know, there's always a level of interpretation, as we've seen with recent issues around statues and things of that nature. And so, but they do have a much more prominent staying power, and I think that's what makes them kind of, they're so much more safe in our minds.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it now to Barnard Professor Ignacio Galán.
Hi, thank you very much, Karen, and super happy to be here and to learn from you all. It's really an honor to be part of this collaboration. So we're going to move now to questions that address sharing. We're interested in strategies and practices of participation, collaboration, and co-creation, mutual aid systems and grassroots networks, the sharing of skills and resources, and forms of exchange that might lead to more equitable and just futures. I'm going to suggest we start with a question from Lucas from the CCA, since it might help continue these conversations about the intergenerational knowledge and give the chance to Dorothy to add to it. Lucas, I don't know if you want to ask your question.
Go for it. Just talk.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear us? Sorry, we're doing this like big room situation
Yeah.
here. Nacha, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
The library has been tasked with taking on a lot of different roles in the last few decades, ranging from childcare to providing meals to the unhoused. Do you believe that the library is spreading itself too thin, and how could the institution be better suited for said responsibilities? This question is for Dorothy.
Thank you, Lucas. Wow, that's a really triggering question for me, because I've been a librarian long enough to have a different set of standards and motivations than is currently in vogue. I feel like we are spreading ourselves thin, and it's you know, I feel like as a national institution, we've decided to remain relevant during the in this, you know, high-tech period. Once the internet came in, there was a lot of what would I call existential crisis going on in the profession. How do we remain relevant? We have in Oakland, as was mentioned, done a lot of things that heretofore were not part of our mission. And we're ill-equipped to deal with many of the issues that we now face, having taken on these tasks of providing meals and providing, you mentioned childcare. It's not really childcare, but in a way it is. If you're a latchkey kid, like I was, you just stay in the library until somebody comes home, right? But also our community is in crisis. There's a lot of mental illness, a lot of drug abuse, a lot of violence, and all of that, being that we're one of the last truly democratic institutions, comes into the library. While librarians have taken on these tasks, these roles to answer societal needs that we see, it doesn't mean that we're equipped to do it. So we do a lot of trainings about how to address transgender people, or how, you know, to provide people, you know, health kits, you know, with tampons and shaving kits and stuff like that. But also what we need to do is something like San Francisco, is hire a social worker. You know, if you want to go into social work, go into social work. What that does, each role we take outside of our traditional roles moves us away from being good at our traditional roles. So what I'm saying is not necessarily popular in my profession, but also what I've seen is people yielding their roles, the social contract that they've made with the public. Well, the library can do it, so let them help people register for low-income housing or food stamps or whatever it is. And that's not to say that people don't need these things. They absolutely do. It's just we are not equipped, neither financially or vocationally, to deal with many of the problems that we face. And of course, being that we are dealing with so much, for a certain segment of the population, they feel now unwelcome to come into the library. I heard one gentleman say, well, the library is just for homeless people now, right? Which was startling to me. But that was his perception. So I don't know. I'm more of a traditionalist in that way. It's one of the few areas of my life where I'm a traditionalist, but you know, that's what it is. What say you, Walter? You're over there smiling.
No, it's almost as if, you know, all of the infrastructure, you know, particularly in brown and Black communities, is almost as if, you know, collectively we've given up. And so there has to be these secondary and tertiary kind of strategies to take care of what the collective have given up. And, you know, a lot of this goes back to knowledge, but as you were talking, I was just thinking about, you know, a place where we don't think about intergenerational stories and where life is going on is in these large projects that were built 50 so years ago, the Acorn Housing Project, Peralta, Bayview Hunters Point. This is generations. You know, people tend to look at these housing projects as, oh, someone only lived there for 10 years. I mean, I started working on Acorn 20 some years ago, and I was blown away by, I was working on a project last year. The same woman that I met 20 years ago is still there. And now she's running the housing project, but she was the daughter of someone running a housing project. But she always tells me she's third generation. And it kind of blows your mind then. It's like, okay, that's so much knowledge is in these places, but we kind of think of them as these separate places where no one really lives, but there's life. And I just found out that all of the kids in the third generation now are in Vallejo. And they actually still come back to Acorn to use the swimming pool and all of those things. And so you have these very interesting sort of geographies, right, happening. But we don't see the city that way. Somehow we see those projects as these autonomous places, but there's still places where people are living and people are being born and people are prospering. And so that's another place that we should be looking to.
Thank you so much for this answers. We have now a question from Shannon and Susan from Barnard Columbia Colleges regarding participation.
Yes, thank you all for being here and sharing your knowledge with us. I wanted to ask, in what ways have your respective practices and organizations engaged participatory design processes in your developmental processes, and what challenges and meaningful bottom-up engagement have you encountered? And in turn, how have you sought to reconcile conflicts that might manifest between local community members that may hold conflicting agendas and desires from those of your firm, colleagues, volunteers, clients, and other stakeholders?
Hi, I'm Susan, and just to add to this, and my question is a little bit different, so you can kind of decide which parts of each question you want to answer. But I was wondering if any of you could talk about how, and Walter in particular, how you go about the design process for short-term projects differently from long-term and permanent projects, and how you embed longevity and long-lasting effects into projects that are temporary, and how do you ensure that permanent projects change and adapt with the neighborhood?
I'm assuming we all believe in participatory or democratic principles of design, I'm assuming. And, you know, we try to get to know a place. I don't like the term participatory design because it's becoming almost a trope that, you know, you go meet with communities, have 3 meetings and give them 3 different schemes and then they vote. We choose to use a different process. We call them scenarios, where we work with the community and we just ask what if. We ask a lot of what ifs, right? And we're just trying to tease out what is important to people. Knowing the project, you know, in one way, we know what the end product is going to be. Like if I'm working on a park, I know it's going to be a park. The thing that we try to get at is how do we make it different? And how do we use the DNA of the place to make something different? And that's all I can ask, I guess, of the work. And difference to us means that people have a voice in it, and it's our job then to manifest that difference. Because it's really hard to say that, you know, you've gone through a participatory process and the project comes out looking like all the rest of them. You know, it's really crazy if it does that. And I'll give you an example. Lafayette Square Park in downtown Oakland, it's like 25 years old now, or 20 years old. And we spent $1.5 million in like mid-90s on this project. We went back into the history and we learned that in the 20s, Lafayette Square was a place where people hung out during the Depression, and it got a moniker, Old Man's Park. Then in the 50s, the Women's Auxiliary Club came and beautified the park. But we went through all of these layers and stories and even talking with people there. And it was very clear that people remembered these things. And the city, all the city wanted to do was remove people. And the reason why it looks the way it looks is that we listened to all those stories and then made a design that reinforced those stories. And while doing that, it actually created a series of spaces where people could actually be by themselves. Because people at the time, homelessness was an issue, right? And people, I had this optimistic view that if I could give the guy who's screaming, there's demons in my food, a space by himself, and I could give people who wanted to have their lunch a space by themselves, it would work. And that's why the spaces are codified the way they are, but they also reinforce all that physical history. And to me, it's lasted 25 years. Now the new people around want to put in bocce ball courts and all these things, which I completely refuse to support and literally scream from the housing, no, you cannot have bocce, you gotta put the horseshoes back. And those are things that are, reminders that, people know when they're being pushed out. Bocce would literally say, you're not welcome here, versus little things like horseshoes would say, you're welcome. So I do think that there are these little things you can do, but in the end of the day, I think Lafayette's going to change because there are people who are moving around who don't want to live next to certain people. And I can't control that because the city is going to get to that tipping point at a certain point.
Any other contribution to this topic? Otherwise,
there were a lot of questions asked, Ignacio. Can someone repeat a few of them to me?
It was both about engaging communities in different processes through your different forms of practice, and also the relationship between short-term projects and lasting effects for the communities that you engage with through your work.
Well, for a library, we do a lot of surveying of patrons. One of our administrators just last week talked about survey fatigue, which I had never heard of. But I see librarianship, and the way I've practiced it is, certainly there is a professional collection development, collection management mission that I follow and have to follow, that we all have to follow. But there's also listening. That's one of the key skills that a librarian has. We're listening to our community and hopefully engaging in our community enough, not just as librarians, but as citizens, to know what it is this community needs. A West Oakland branch library doesn't need the same thing. The patrons of that branch don't need the same thing as the Chavez branch library in Fruitvale. So each of our, Oakland has 16 branch libraries and the main library and the African American Museum. And each of those places have a really unique character. And that's a result of listening and engaging, but that works in tandem with our own professional steerage of, if you will, of programs, exhibits, and collections, with all the multi-forms of the collections that we have. So, but, as Walter was alluding to, there does tend to be this tipping point where, some group of people will want one thing and another group of people need another thing or want another thing. And so that's something we're constantly in negotiation around. And so we also have, these very volatile we have a reconsideration committee, when people decide this shouldn't be in your library at all. This service should not be offered at all. And so we listen to those people as well. But, the library has to stand its ground on some level. You know, we are and have been for over 150 years a institution that is trying to respond very broadly to the community, you know, and try to welcome, but also serve everybody. That is the nature of the American Public Library. And so I would say we're constantly negotiating. Now here in the Oakland History Center, I am looking to, as I said before, to represent as many people as I can with as reliable information as I can. So anyway, I feel like I'm talking too much.
No, this is super helpful,
Yeah.
and I appreciate these answers. I'm gonna pass it now to Nataly and Neeraj, who are gonna moderate the last section of this conversation. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Nacho. And I'll just start off the topic. The last topic we're looking at is care, and I'll just start it off on behalf of Nataly and I. So care, as we're defining it, includes systems of reproduction as opposed to industrial modes of production, which include childcare and elderly care, self-care for the environment, and care for the community. So I want to pass it over to Lizzie from CCA to get us started with the first question.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So my question is, religious institutions in Oakland have a history of helping support community groups. For example, St. Augustine's Church was used as a meeting place for the Black Panther Party. To what extent does your own personal faith community or other faith communities impact people on a personal level, a community level, and on a city level in Oakland? Or are there other communities that come to mind too?
Was everyone able to hear that? I know we're in real life here together, so hopefully that came through. It was really about the role of religious institutions in the neighborhood.
Yes. Thank you for first of all saying, because I was looking for a tile and I couldn't find the person talking, so that was very helpful. Thank you for locating yourself.
Maybe Lizzie, you can wave.
yeah, wait, there you go. Awesome. Thank you for that question. So I'm going to take a shot at that. I think that one of the, remembering that just all communities are diverse. Religious communities are diverse. And I know that one of the things I often challenge people on, or try to challenge the idea of, is something like the Black church, as if it, with one set of leaders, with one polity, with what, there are diverse communities. And there's, and I when I was even in seminary, one of my professors would say, if you had 10 people on a pew, you've got 10 different versions of your church. I would actually say 20. People disagreeing with themselves about what the church is from one moment to the next. So, but I think that when we talk about, when I think of religious, my own tradition, it really is out of African-American Protestant traditions. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about these spaces is that, and what I've kind of come to really think about, is these are spaces, particularly in the history of African-American religion, our Protestant and to some extent Catholic, Black Catholic congregations have been spaces that decenter whiteness to a large degree and center Black consciousness and thinking. And that can be a very vital, fertile ground for critiquing systems and to provide space for all kinds of possibilities. Now, African-American religion has been both liberative, it also has its accommodationist impulses as well. So it is not one thing, but we as human beings are not one thing. We are a mixture of many things. So, but as institutions, these have been spaces that have, yes, I see St. Columba there. Thank you, David Peters, for yes, one of our community, predominantly African-American parish. So I think these have been spaces that have allowed for people to think in ways that challenge the dominant worldview, and have created spaces where people can begin to strategize and mobilize, but just also reinforce the importance of their own lived experience and the knowledge. So these have been kind of epistemologically or, places where people can say, actually, what do we know? Even though the rest of society that may have more power in, economic, social, political, what can we reaffirm that we know to be true? So there's, and I'll use this as an example. I'll use a song as an example. Within the African-American tradition, there's a hymn that says, I got shoes, you got shoes, all of God's children's got shoes. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. And this is the point at which the enslaved population would look to the big house. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. And heaven, I'm gonna walk all over God's heaven. It was a social political critique in the guise of a hymn. I think that also is, and so I think when we talk about what does it do for people, personal, community, and and at these various levels, I think intrinsically it speaks. So it's, I think we can talk about the extrinsic rewards that come from mobilizing and getting laws changed, which I think are very important. But I think in many regards, it affirms people's worth. It affirms their humanity. These spaces affirm their stories, their voice, their agency. And that is something, and gives them longevity to do that. So even if the whole world tells you you ain't worth nothing, these spaces can. They don't always, and not in every instance, and in fact have many instances where they don't, but they can. And often, if we look over the long arc of the history of African-American congregations, and I think some similar things can be said about other communities of faith as well. Over the long tradition, they are spaces that help to develop a sense of one's worth, agency, and provide spaces where critical knowledge can be affirmed and produced. So I will stop there.
I would just add, they're also the place where I see trauma being, dealt with, right? Which we don't talk a lot about. That, living in these landscapes are very traumatic, and for years of dealing with that, and having these spaces, right, that one can always rely on. I think I've seen, in the neighborhood, these being those places that people can go to. We're working right now in San Francisco with Freedom West, the AME church there. And again, these stories that we don't know. Doing the Fillmore redevelopment, the AME church decided, hey, we'll do our own development. And they held on to 2 blocks in San Francisco. And 50 years later, they're sitting on this resource. And so they're looking forward to developing it through their own eyes, which is, like, for me, it's like one of the first projects I get to work on where, Blackness is in control, right? And the critique now, they're trying to do a high density tower in the city. And it's interesting, the critique that's coming, right? Versus the critique that some of the other towers don't get. And so it'll be interesting to see how these projects go forward, seeing that they're being initiated from a different place.
So we would like to continue with a question from Christian at Barnard Columbia.
Yeah, hi, I'm Christian. I'm hailing from New York at the moment. My question is related to a lot of the things that have been discussed already, and this idea that place can shape identity, both individual and collective. And I was wondering if you could speak to the ways in which access to networks of care, both informal and institutional, shape a collective identity within neighborhoods in West Oakland and the identity of West Oakland as a whole.
Can you pose the question one more time for me, please?
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing about how access to networks of care, both in an informal sense, like the church, and more an institutional sense, like care facilities, hospitals, that sort of thing, contribute to collective identity and shape identity of neighborhoods in West Oakland, and how that might differ between neighborhoods that have different access.
I will try to keep this brief because I think Walter and Dorothy may have more to say about this. I think I can speak to connecting identity. I'll just give a quick example of an experience. We had a person in our neighborhood who really regarded themselves as somebody who watched the children on their way to school back and forth. And when that person was facing challenges of being able to stay in the neighborhood, not at their post one day. And then another community member came and said, "Where were you? My child was coming and going, something happened, you weren't here." And that was deeply, deeply jarring to this member of the community. And so I think that that speaks to the kind of informal care, I guess, that is, informal in that it doesn't have, she's not a 501(c)(3) or, it may not be recognized within sort of the political economic structure, but it was very much recognized. And it was the reciprocity of, it gave this person, despite not having the ability to make other kinds of contributions because of education or whatever, this was a way in which this person could contribute to the well-being of the community. And when their own presence and status in the neighborhood was physically threatened through housing, it really destabilized what they could offer. And I think some of the hurt was not being able to fulfill the way in which they understood themselves and their contribution, and having that threatened. I don't know but there was a real sense of providing, there was a shared care of the kids, and this person's ability to provide kind of what one sociologist calls kind of the other mother or community mothering, was really not able to do that, and was actually being moved out to Vallejo. And it was one of those proximity stripped identity, the loss of proximity was stripped identity, or an aspect of it. So, but I'll throw it to Walter or to Dorothy.
Yeah, I'll just build on that. In my neighborhood, there are lots of places of care. I mean, there are lots of nonprofits, a lot of people, I guess, doing more social work. There's very little, how can I say, infrastructure that supports the informal. I really like what Leslie was saying. I've literally, over the 20 years, just seen the OGs and the OLs just disappear off the street, right? Because people look at a collection of people in a space and they immediately go, they're homeless. And then immediately they attack. And there's a little square, St. Andrew's Square, like down the block from me. The city paid someone $30,000 to do a community thing. They put a fence around this space with a lock. And their whole idea was, we want to create a safe space for the elderly people across the street. So the OGs and the OLs are not part of that. I mean, old guys and old women, right? I mean, the people who are out on the street, they're not part of, they don't look like they could live in that place. And so therefore, they've been completely wiped out. But in hindsight, they were the ones who kept your car safe. They were the ones who told you stories. And I remember after living on Filbert for 1 year, a guy stopped me at the corner and said, "You're that professor guy, right?" And I hadn't talked to anyone. And so just having that kind of community around, which is slowly disappearing because it's getting designed out, right? But this kind of just informal urbanism that we're not even allowed to sort of be in space unfettered. We're constantly being harassed. And so those are the kinds of places I think we need more sort of reinforcement, more articulation, that we need these vague terrains. We need these spaces that people can be in, that are not just, a park or not just a square, but spaces that people want to be in, because a lot of the people just hanging out, watching the street. And there's nothing wrong with that.
So this conversation has very nicely segued into what I wanted to share with you all today. I'm reading during my commute a fascinating book that came out this year. It's called Feminist City, claiming space in a man-made world. And one of the chapters is about City of Moms and how cities are often very challenging for women, particularly women of color and poor women who rely very heavily on what Leslie was talking about, that kind of and Walter were talking about, that kind of informal circles of support that people have that have been a part of Oakland's history from the very beginning, probably a part of everybody's history from the very beginning. We rely on our grandmothers, we rely on our neighbors, our sisters and aunties. This is the book. It's by Leslie Kern, K-E-R-N, and she's a Canadian scholar who's written this fascinating little book about how the way we design cities and live in cities and how we expect women to live in cities and the challenges they face in metropolitan areas can and should be changed in ways that it doesn't work for women. And so the chapter that I found particularly relevant to what we were just now talking about is the City of Moms. And she talks specifically about a variety of cities. Even though she's Canadian, she's looking at research and work from architects and planners and sociologists all over the world, and how people engage and are impacted by the city. So I highly recommend this, Feminist City. Yeah, so I just wanted to, that's what I wanted to add to that. We have a long history of support by churches. You know, Oakland's first African-American Methodist Episcopal Church, the first church in town, Shiloh, AME, started the first school. They've created places, as someone mentioned, St. Augustine, which is not the St. Augustine, by the way, on Telegraph Avenue. It was the one on 27th and West that was affiliated with the Black Panther Breakfast Program. Recreational activities have occurred and been facilitated by churches and also just informal groups of people. You know, we need to make space, especially in the African-American community, because we were shut out of so many spaces that were considered common spaces, but not for us. You know, we had up until the mid 40s, a segregated YMCA and YWCA. You know, there was a Linden Street YWCA for women, for example, and they did everything from job training to housing to job skill training, you know, teaching people how to type, how to file, you know. And so there's always been this kind of like parallels of support in West Oakland because of things we were at first locked out of, either because of race or financially, we couldn't afford it. You know, everything's being commercialized and monetized now. So, which gets back to an earlier question about the relevancy of the library. The library now, as many of you probably know, offers some real life skills like a literacy program and a free computer lab. And scanning and things like that. So just trying to bolster, I guess trying to patch up the broken social contract is what I would say. So.
Thank you. It seems like an ominous note to end on.
I'm sorry. I tend to do that. Sorry.
No, absolutely. It's totally in line with a lot of the conversations we have been having in our design studio about the public library and its role that it's kind of had to grow into. So thank you. That was a really great set of responses from all of you. I'm going to pass it back to Julia. Julia, you got this?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nataly. It's actually amazingly, we can hear you so well, although you are so small on the screen. That's great.
A loud voice, just kidding.
No, the whole group. I just want to say that it was an amazing conversation, and I wish we could just keep continuing it, and such profound thoughts about all levels of engagement and directions. We wanted to keep this roundtable discussion to an hour and a half, respecting and acknowledging everybody's busy lives. So we don't have a time for expanded Q&A, but I wanted to invite everybody to maybe type in the chat like a concluding thought as you are taking in all those awesome discussions that were here, that we heard. My only concern that CCA students don't have, each one of them don't have the access to chat. So maybe, I don't know, Nataly and Neeraj, maybe you can pass the computer for chat, or maybe each one in the classroom can say like one word of reflection. And thank you all of us for joining from both coasts. And I also want to invite all of us, as we are taking in the responses in the chat and just taking in all these topics, I want to invite us maybe to take a collective breath. We used to do it in community meetings on Zoom. All of us are in different locations. Some of us are in very different locations, but all of us are connected to the same earth that we are on. So maybe we can all maybe take in what we heard with a breath and be connected emotionally, spiritually. Thank you. Thank you. I think we should close at 12:30. Amazing.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thanks to all the students for doing such good work and asking these questions. This is fantastic.
Yes, this was really good. Thank you. It's really been an honor to be with you and to learn from you. This has been amazing.
Yeah, Leslie and Dorothy need to get together. Got to come down before you retire.
Yeah, really. And you're just around the corner.